Hey guys, tonight we begin with the haunting endurance of human survival, not in battles or glory, but in the quiet struggle against the cold itself. Stories of medieval peasants facing winters so brutal that time itself seemed to freeze. Tales once lost in whispers, now resurfacing through the forgotten traces of their lives, the ways they ate, slept, and prayed just to see the first thaw. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into a winter so long and so silent that even the earth seemed to forget the sound of life. When winter came to the villages, it did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, long before the first snow touched the thatched roofs or the frost coated the wooden fences. It began as a faint chill in the evenings, a change in the way the air moved through the fields, softer, heavier, as if the wind itself had grown tired. The peasants knew this feeling well. They could sense the season turning long before any calendar could tell them so. A faint mist began to linger longer each morning, and the sun, though still bright, no longer carried warmth. The world seemed to grow slower, and so did the people. By late autumn, the villagers had already begun their quiet preparations. Fields were stripped bare of their last harvests. Carts groaned along muddy paths, carrying bundles of firewood, sacks of grain, and the final offerings of the land before it fell asleep. The rhythm of the year slowed to a kind of waiting for cold, for hunger, for the stillness that would soon take hold. In those last weeks of November, smoke rose from chimneys almost all day, curling softly into the grey sky, as if each home was exhaling its own sigh of resignation. They had seen this before, and they would see it again. Winter was not an event. It was a visitor who stayed too long, who ate what little you had, and never apologized. Inside the cottages, life became smaller. The single room that once echoed with the chatter of daily work now grew dim and muffled. Windows, small and covered with oiled parchment instead of glass, let in little light. The walls seemed to draw closer as families huddled around the hearth. The fire burned constantly, not for comfort, but for survival. Its smoke filled the rafters, staining them black, and a faint, permanent haze hung in the air. The smell of burning wood mixed with the sour scent of wool, sweat, and the earthy dampness of mud floors. For many, warmth was not a guarantee, but a fragile balance, one spark away from life, one gust of wind away from cold. Each morning began with a strange silence, the kind of silence that only exists in winter, heavy, unbroken, almost sacred. When a peasant stepped outside, their boots sank into frost-coated mud, and their breath turned into small ghosts that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The fields stretched before them, stripped bare, frozen, and lifeless. Yet, beneath that stillness, there was a sense of endurance. The same soil that now seemed dead was quietly holding seeds of the next spring hidden under its icy skin. The peasants believed that everything slept, even the earth. It was not death, it was rest. Sometimes, the villagers spoke of how the air itself changed in winter. They said it carried voices. When the wind rushed through the forest, they claimed it was whispering old words, half-forgotten prayers, perhaps the voices of those who had not survived past winters. It was not fear they felt, but familiarity. The past lived close to them, as if the boundaries between the living and the gone grew thin in the cold. When a door creaked open at night, or frost patterns bloomed across the windows like strange flowers, some said it was the winter spirits tracing their way back home. Others simply smiled and stirred the fire. In the medieval mind, such things were never entirely superstition. They were a way of understanding the cold world around them, a way to give the freezing air a face and a reason. As the days shortened, time began to feel strange. Without the sun to measure hours, people moved by instinct. Work shifted indoors, spinning, mending, carving tools, and tending to animals that shared the same cramped space. The animals breathed warmth into the room, their steady movements and quiet sounds part of the rhythm of winter life. Children slept beside them sometimes, beneath wool blankets too thin to block the cold. There was no separation between man and beast during those months, only shared breath, shared warmth, and the day, same unspoken patience to outlast the season. But winter was also when stories returned. At night, when the fire had burned low and the world outside was a dark expanse of ice, the old ones spoke softly. They told tales not of kings or battles, but of winters past of years, when the snow fell for weeks without stopping, when wolves prowled close to the edge of the village, when food ran out and people boiled bark from trees to stay alive. These stories were told not to frighten, but to remember. Each one carried a quiet wisdom, that life continued, that even in hunger, something within them refused to break. The telling itself was a form of survival, a way to keep the mind warm when the body could not be. There was something curious about those long nights, something that visitors from warmer lands could never quite understand. The deeper the cold grew, the more alive the senses became. The creak of timber, the sound of wind beneath the door, the faint hiss of burning wood, these were the sounds of existence itself. The world had narrowed to a single point, the fire, the family, and the endless patience of waiting for spring. Some villagers claimed that, in the stillest hours, when even the wind paused, you could hear the snow settling, a faint, almost musical sound, like tiny sighs as if the world itself was breathing in its sleep. Every so often, a traveller would pass through a monk, a merchant, or someone merely lost. The villagers would open their doors, offering a corner near the fire, a bowl of thin stew, and a silence that needed no words. These visitors often spoke of strange things, cities where stone streets never froze, lands where olive trees stayed green all year. The peasants listened but did not envy them. There was a certain pride in their endurance. To survive a winter in the villages of medieval Europe was to belong to something greater, a quiet, shared understanding that comfort was temporary but endurance was eternal. And yet, there was always something strange, almost mystical, about the cold itself. Sometimes, when the fire burned low and the room was dim, the frost on the window would form patterns, circles, spirals, delicate branching lines that looked almost alive. Children were told not to touch them, for those were the fingers of Jack Frost, or as the elders called him, Asterisk the White Guest. Asterisk they believed he came to mark the houses, to test the strength of their walls and their hearts. The colder the night, the more intricate his designs became. Some said that if you stared long enough, you could see faces hidden within the frost faces of ancestors, long gone, watching over those still enduring below. By the middle of winter, even the smallest tasks became rituals of survival. Breaking ice to fetch water, repairing holes in roofs with frozen fingers, walking miles through snow to fetch a bundle of sticks, every act had weight. And through it all, no one spoke much of the cold itself. They had learned that to name it was to invite it in. Instead, they moved with quiet grace, conserving energy, conserving words. The world outside could rage and freeze, but within those wooden walls, a small, persistent warmth endured. It was fragile, yes, but also defiant, a reminder that life, even in its simplest form, had its own kind of courage. When winter came to the villages, it was not seen as an enemy. It was a teacher, a mirror, a measure of endurance. It stripped away all that was unnecessary and left behind only what mattered: warmth, company, patience, and a fire that must never go out. In those frozen months, time seemed to stop, but something deeper continued beneath the surface, unseen yet constant, waiting quietly for the thaw. And if you were to stand in one of those villages centuries ago, as the night deepened and the stars shimmered faintly through the mist, you might notice something peculiar. In the distance, a faint glow in the woods, not a flame, but a shimmer, almost alive. The villagers spoke of it rarely, but some said it was the soul of winter itself, wandering, watching, counting those who still endured. No one dared to follow it, and by morning it was always gone. But its memory lingered like the cold long after the snow had melted away. The cold that lived inside the walls was unlike the one that swept through the fields or drifted across the rooftops. Outside, it was sharp and open, a thing that could sting your face and numb your fingers. But inside, it was slower, quieter, a presence that lingered in corners, crept through the cracks, and breathed softly when no one was watching. In those medieval cottages, cold was not an intruder, it was a quiet resident that refused to leave. Even the thickest walls of clay and straw could not keep it out completely. It seeped in through the floor, climbed up the beams, and made a home in the spaces between breaths. Each cottage had its own kind of cold, its own temperament. In one, it might smell faintly of smoke and damp earth. In another, it might carry a hint of rot from stored grain or wet wool. The peasants spoke of their walls as if they were alive, listening to the sounds of the wind and the whispers of those within. The walls groaned, shifted, and sometimes sighed during the long nights. When the fire dimmed, you could hear faint pops from the timber, the soft crack of ice forming on the inside of windows. These were small sounds, but in the stillness of winter they became voices, the quiet murmuring of a home that was trying, just like its inhabitants, to survive the season. The fire, though constant, was never enough. It burned low and cautious, for wood was precious. Each log had been gathered months ago, dried and stacked carefully, and every piece used now meant one less for the weeks ahead. The peasants learned to ration warmth the way others rationed food. They fed the fire sparingly, letting it fade into embers before reviving it again. The glow that came from the hearth was faint and orange, painting the faces around it in soft light and long shadows. The rest of the room remained in half-darkness corners, filled with quiet shapes that only revealed themselves when the flames flickered. At night, the cold became heavier. It pressed down from the roof, slid along the walls, and wrapped around everything. Blankets and furs were layered thick, but even then, the chill found its way through. Many slept close together for warmth, parents, children, even animals, all sharing the same breath in a small, smoky room. It was not comfort so much as survival. To move even a little was to lose what little heat the body had gathered. Sleep came slowly, and often people dreamed of warmth of the sun, of summer fields, of light. Some said that the colder the night, the warmer the dreams. There was something strange about how the cold behaved in those cottages. It seemed to choose its places. Certain corners stayed colder than others, even when the fire burned strong. The peasants said those were places the warmth could not touch, the sleeping corners, they called them. Some believed they were haunted by old spirits who had once lived there and never left. The children were warned not to play near them, and no one ever sat there for long. Yet, sometimes, when the night grew especially silent, a faint sound could be heard from those corners, like a slow creak, or the soft drip of melting frost. Whether it was the house shifting, or something older and unseen, no one knew for certain. The walls, though rough and simple, held their own secrets. In many cottages, small holes and cracks had been filled with straw, rags, or bits of cloth. Over the years, These became part of the walls themselves, a strange patchwork of old lives sealed into the structure. It was said that some families even placed small charms inside the walls when they were built, bits of bone, iron, nails, or a tiny carved figure meant to ward off the winter spirits. These talismans were never spoken of openly, but they were there, tucked behind the plaster, hidden in the beams, quietly standing guard as the cold pressed in. During the darkest part of winter, when the sun barely rose above the horizon, the air inside could grow so still that breath hung in front of the mouth like pale mist. In those moments, time felt suspended. The house, the people, even the air seemed frozen together in a single, unbroken silence. Sometimes, an icicle would form along the edge of the roof and grow longer each day, shimmering faintly in the dim light. When one finally fell and shattered on the ground, it made a sound so sharp and clear it seemed almost like glass breaking, a reminder that even stillness had its edges. There were stories, whispered among the villagers, about the breathing walls. They said that on the coldest nights, if you pressed your ear against the wall just before dawn, you could hear it exhale, a long, slow sigh, like the sound of the forest wind, only softer. No one knew if it was real or imagined, but those who claimed to have heard it swore it felt alive, not threatening, but watchful. Some said it was the spirit of the house itself, waking briefly before the morning light returned. Others thought it was the cold leaving, only to come back again by nightfall. Whatever it was, it gave the cottages a strange kind of companionship, as if even the walls understood the hardship of winter. The daily routine within those walls was quiet and repetitive. A woman might sit near the hearth, spinning thread, her fingers stiff from the chill. A child would fetch a bucket of snow to melt for water. Someone would scrape ice from the door latch, or patch a draft with moss. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and slow. Talking was kept to a minimum, not out of sadness, but because silence felt more natural in that season. It was as if sound itself would disturb the fragile balance that kept the cold at bay. Yet, despite the hardship, there was an odd comfort in this stillness. Life was reduced to its simplest elements: heat, breath, shelter. The outside world faded away, and what remained was the sound of the fire, the faint murmur of wind, and the heartbeat of those who endured together. There was beauty in that simplicity, though it was not the kind one would seek. It was a beauty found in endurance, in the quiet persistence of living through the cold that no one could escape. On certain nights, when the moonlight managed to slip through the tiny window and cast pale light across the room, something remarkable could happen. The frost on the inner walls began to shimmer faintly, catching the glow in delicate patterns that seemed to move like slow, frozen rivers. The villagers called it the walls dreaming. They believed it was the spirit of the house showing its memories, glimpses of summers past, of harvests, of laughter that had once filled the room. It was a peaceful thing, though fleeting by morning, the shimmer would be gone, replaced again by the grey breath of another cold day. The cold that lived inside the walls was never defeated. It could be softened, slowed, held back for a time, but never truly banished. It was as much a part of the cottage as the people who lived within it. It taught them patience, silence, and gratitude for even the smallest spark of warmth. In that frozen quiet, life continued, not brightly, not easily, but with a kind of dignity that could only exist where comfort was scarce. And so, the cold remained, not cruelly, but faithfully. Year after year, it returned to the same walls, whispering through the same cracks, curling around the same sleeping figures. It was the unspoken guest of every winter, the one presence that never truly left, reminding them gently, endlessly, of the fragile warmth that defined their world. Fire was the fragile heart of every medieval home, a trembling light that held back the long dark months of winter. It was both a comfort and a burden, something that could save, but also something that could easily turn against those who depended on it. In the quiet villages of Europe, people learned early that warmth was never a gift. It had to be earned, carefully gathered, carefully guarded, and never wasted. To tend the fire was not just a task. It was a kind of devotion, a slow, constant act of survival that filled the long hours when the wind howled and frost pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest. The hearth was always at the centre, not only of the house, but of life itself. Built of stone and earth, it glowed faintly even when the flames had died, its ashes warm long after the night had ended. The air around it smelled of smoke, soot, and sometimes animal fat, used to help coax a spark from damp wood. Everything revolved around this small circle of heat meals, talk, rest, even prayer. There were no chimneys in the earliest cottages. Smoke drifted up through a hole in the roof or seeped through cracks in the thatch. It hung in the air like a ghostly fog, clinging to hair and clothing, turning everything a shade darker over time. Children grew up breathing that smoke. To them, it was not unpleasant. It was the smell of home, of life continuing despite the cold. Wood was life, and its scarcity defined the rhythm of winter. Every twig had value. The peasants collected it, all fallen branches, broken fences, even bits of bark stripped from trees. In poor years, they burned peat dug from the wetlands. It scent heavy and earthy. Some villages used dried dung when wood was gone entirely, and though it filled the room with a strange, bitter smell, it gave warmth all the same. The fire didn't care what it ate, only that it was fed, and so people fed it whatever they could, even as they grew thinner themselves. There was an understanding between them and the flame. You give, and I give back. You neglect me, and I go dark. Keeping the fire alive through the night was an art. It could not be left to chance. Before sleep, someone would stir the ashes, bury a small ember deep within, and cover it with fine dust. In the morning, they would uncover it carefully, coaxing it back to life with straw or dry moss. When it caught, the faintest wisp of smoke would rise a small victory, quiet but immense. Some families kept a single coal burning for months, never letting it die completely. To lose it was to lose more than heat. It meant starting over, with no guarantee that a spark could be found again. There were no matches, no quick flame, only flint, steel, and patience. The smoke that filled the cottages was a strange companion. It burned the eyes and blackened the rafters, but it also preserved the wood, keeping rot and insects away. It curled along the ceiling like a living thing, shaping itself into slow-moving patterns that shifted with every gust of wind. Some swore they could see faces in it, pale shapes forming for an instant before fading back into the air. The old ones said those were the ancestors, drawn to the fire's warmth, reminding the living that they were never truly alone. Whether anyone believed it or not, no one waved the smoke away. It was left to drift, to fill the space, to move as it wished. Every family had their rituals for tending the fire. Some whispered a small blessing before lighting it each morning, a soft murmur meant to invite warmth into the home. Others placed a pinch of salt into the first spark, believing it would keep misfortune away. And in some villages, people avoided lending fire to neighbours after sunset, for it was said that sharing flame at night would invite hunger into both homes. Such superstitions were not born from fear alone, but from experience. They reflected the delicate balance between warmth and loss, a balance everyone understood too well. The strange thing about fire was that it never seemed to belong entirely to the living. In the quiet hours, when the house was still, the flame sometimes moved, oddly flaring for no reason, flickering toward the door as if drawn by something unseen. There were stories of fires that refused to light in certain cottages, no matter how dry the wood. People said that the fire itself could sense sorrow or unrest or something unspoken in the air. A hearth that burned too easily after a death, they believed, meant the soul of the departed had found its way home. Whether true or not, these thoughts gave the long nights a kind of quiet mystery, a reminder that even the simplest things could hold something beyond understanding. The battle between warmth and cold was not fought with noise or struggle, but with stillness and patience. People learned to sit close, their bodies curved toward the fire, their faces half lit by its glow. The fire spoke in small sounds, the crack of sap, the sigh of smoke, the soft collapse of embers. Every sound carried meaning. When wood hissed, it meant it was too wet. When it popped sharply, it was good and dry. They listened, not just to pass time, but to feel connected to the life inside the flame. There was a kind of comfort in that, the quiet assurance that something still lived, even when the world outside slept under snow. And yet, warmth was always temporary. The moment the fire weakened, the cold reclaimed its ground. It slid silently across the floor, reached up the walls, and breathed against the skin. To keep it away was to keep moving, to mend, to stir, to breathe. When someone dozed too far from the hearth, the chill crept close and woke them again. It was a constant rhythm: heat, fade, spark, smoke, repeated endlessly through the season. Each night, the fire burned a little smaller, and each morning it had to be reborn. Sometimes, the villagers spoke of a strange light that could be seen in the woods. On the coldest nights, a faint blue flame that hovered just above the snow. They called it the cold fire. Those who had seen it swore it made no heat, only light, and that animals fled from it in silence. No one knew what it truly was, a trick of mist perhaps, or gas from the marshes, but few dared to follow it. They said it appeared near homes where the fire had gone out for good, as if it came to collect the last breath of warmth that lingered in the air. Whether real or imagined, its story was passed down for generations, growing softer and stranger with every telling. The struggle for heat was never truly won. It was simply endured, one night at a time. But in that endurance, there was something deeply human, the endless tending of fragile light against the immensity of cold. Each fire that burned, no matter how small, was an act of quiet defiance. It was a reminder that even in the darkest season, something within them refused to yield. And so, through smoke and ash, through ritual and patience, they kept the flame alive, a single trembling heart, glowing softly in the frozen world. When winter deepened and the land fell silent, the fields themselves seemed to vanish beneath the weight of frost. What had once been green and alive, the gentle waves of wheat, the hum of insects, the rustle of stalks, now lay hidden under a vast, pale stillness. The soil hardened until even the hoof of an ox could not break it. The peasants would walk along the edges of their land, boots crunching over ice, trying to remember which patch had once yielded barley and which had grown rye. In winter, everything looked the same. The frozen earth erased all borders, all distinctions. It was as if nature had taken back her map. There was something strange about those frozen fields. People said they made no sound, not even when the wind swept over them. The snow absorbed every noise, turning the world into a kind of soft silence. You could shout into the distance and hear almost nothing in return, as though the earth had closed its ears. The peasants found that silence both peaceful and unsettling. It reminded them that they were small, just fleeting shadows against something much older and far more patient. The land slept, but it was not a gentle sleep. It was a sleep that refused to be disturbed. The fields were not empty of presence, though. If one stood still long enough, in the dim light of afternoon, there were faint creaks beneath the ice, small, brittle sighs of life still clinging somewhere under the surface. Mice tunneled through the snow in narrow paths, seeking bits of grain dropped months ago. Ravens circled overhead, watching for anything that dared to move. And sometimes, just before dusk, people said they could see thin wisps of mist rising from the furrows, shaped like the ghosts of the harvest itself. The old ones called it the breath of the soil, and they treated it with quiet reverence. To them, it was proof that the earth never truly died, it only rested. But the granaries told a different story. Inside, the smell was dry and sharp, a mix of dust and old straw. The floor was swept clean, the bins half empty. Every handful of grain mattered. Each kernel represented a day of life. A small, golden promise against the cold. The peasants measured out their stores with care, not too much, not too little, always with the knowledge that the next harvest was impossibly far away. They had learned to stretch what they had, to grind what was left with patience, and to mix in whatever could fill the belly. Barley was blended with acorns, flour with ground bark, bread with the last crumbs of last year's crop. They understood hunger in a way that modern people cannot. It was not the sharp hunger of a missed meal, but a slow, thoughtful one. The kind that becomes a companion rather than an enemy. It made them careful, deliberate. It made them notice things. The way frost formed on the grain sacks like a thin lace of glass, or how the smallest mouse could leave tracks that looked almost human when seen in the candlelight. Hunger sharpened their senses until even the smell of a neighbour's baking felt like a story from another world. Still, there were rituals to keep hope alive. In some villages, a few sheaves of wheat were never threshed. They were tied with red string and hung above the door, an offering to the spirit of the fields, a quiet reminder to the earth to return when the time was right. Sometimes they whispered small prayers over them, words that had no clear meaning anymore, handed down from generations long gone. Others kept a single grain in a locket or pouch, believing it carried the warmth of summer within it. They said that if you held it close to your chest during the coldest nights, you could almost feel the hum of the sun inside. The frozen fields did not forgive waste. Every seed mattered. Sometimes, when the snow began to melt too early, water would carry away bits of grain left forgotten. The villagers believed those seeds belonged to the spirits, now gifts to whatever lived beneath the frost. They never went to retrieve them. To disturb that offering, they said, would bring bad luck for the coming year. And so the snowmelt became a kind of silent negotiation between the living and the land, each giving a little, each waiting for the other to wait. Strangely, there were tales of people who could hear the fields whispering during the deepest parts of winter. They said that if you pressed your ear against the frozen ground, you could hear a soft crackling, like far-away rain or the shifting of roots. Some swore it was the sound of seeds dreaming, waiting for the thaw. Others thought it was just the ice settling. But in that age, when every sound carried meaning, even a murmur from the earth was enough to keep people listening. The idea that the soil itself might be alive, that it might remember them, brought comfort. It gave purpose to their patience. The granaries, though, held their own ghosts. The wooden walls creaked as if breathing, the air heavy with the smell of grain dust and faint mildew. If you listened closely, you could almost hear movement within the shuffle of a rat, the drop of a kernel, or perhaps something less ordinary. Some villagers believed that the spirit of the last harvest lingered inside, invisible but restless, counting every grain that remained. They spoke softly there, never laughing, never making sudden noise. To spill grain was to offend it, to waste life itself. And if one found a grain that had sprouted in the dark, a thin green shoot pushing from the sack, they took it as a sign, a quiet message from the sleeping fields that the world would wake again. No matter how deep the snow, it was always strange how time felt different during those months. The days moved slowly, as if the sun hesitated to rise too high. Even the shadows seemed thicker, clinging to the walls of barns and granaries longer than they should. People worked in small motions, sweeping, mending, checking the sacks again and again. They knew they could not make more food appear, yet they acted as though their care alone might coax abundance back. In a way, it did. There was meaning in the tending, in the small acts of preservation that said, "We are still here." The hunger season did not bring despair so much as humility. It reminded them that the earth gave only what it chose to give, and that their part was to wait without complaint. The fields outside might be locked in ice, but beneath it the roots still held on, and beneath the hunger there was always the quiet knowledge that warmth would come again. It always had, and so it always would. Still, there was one story half believed, half feared that the elders whispered by the fire. They said that on the coldest nights, when every sound froze in the air, the soil itself would breathe out a faint mist that took the shape of a person, a pale figure walking the fields, head bowed, holding a bundle of withered stalks. They called it the Forgotten Reaper. It was said to visit the granaries of those who had hoarded too much, marking their doors with a thin trail of frost. In the spring, those marked fields would fail to grow. Whether it was true or not, no one wanted to test it. And so, even in their need, they shared what little they could with neighbours, with animals, with the spirits of the land itself. By the end of each long winter, the fields and the people seemed to mirror each other, both thinner, both quiet, both waiting. And when at last the first patches of brown earth appeared through the snow, it felt almost like seeing an old friend stir from sleep. The frozen fields began to breathe again, and the empty granaries, once hollow with echo, began to fill with small sounds of life. Footsteps, laughter, the rustle of preparation. But for now, in that still, endless cold, everything rested in the same silence. The soil, the seeds, and the people who tended them, bound together in patience beneath the frozen sky. There is a certain poetry in how the poor of the Middle Ages dressed for winter, a quiet, resigned art born of necessity, stitched from scraps and patched memories. Warmth, for them, was not something worn, it was something built, layer upon layer, thread upon thread, as if each garment was a whispered prayer against the cold. Their clothing did not protect them fully from the frost, it merely delayed it, softened its bite, made the hours a little more bearable until the sun returned. To dress in winter was to make peace with discomfort, to accept that warmth was not a right, but a small mercy that might or might not come. The peasants' garments were a language of scarcity. Wool was their shield, coarse and uneven, spun from the rough fleece of sheep that lived much like their owners, thin, hardy, and half-starved. They wore tunics that hung heavy with the smell of smoke and earth, the fibres darkened by years of mending. The women layered linen shifts beneath, often so patched they seemed to be made of many lives sewn together. Each layer trapped a thin breath of air, not much, but enough to slow the cold's intrusion. The trick was not in the thickness, but in the patience to keep layering until movement itself became difficult. There was something oddly beautiful in how they accepted this ritual. Dressing for winter was not a hurried act. It was an hour-long process of survival, a daily ceremony performed in silence beside the fire. Every layer was adjusted carefully, every sleeve pulled down to cover the wrist. Even the poorest household had its small traditions, a certain order of garments, a way of wrapping the head or feet passed down through generations. Some families placed small dried herbs between the layers, thyme, lavender, sometimes even a pinch of soil, believing that the scent reminded the body of warmth. Whether it worked or not, no one questioned it. In such a life, belief itself was another form of insulation. They had little by way of shoes. The lucky ones owned boots of thick hide, cracked and stiff from years of wear. Most, however, made do with what they could. Scraps of leather bound with string, or cloth wrappings soaked in fat to keep out moisture. The poor learned the art of straw layering, stuffing handfuls of dry straw or moss into their footwear for extra insulation. It rustled softly with every step, and when it became damp, they replaced it with fresh handfuls. It was a crude solution, but one that carried a strange intimacy with the land itself. They walked literally cushioned by the harvest they had gathered months before, carrying fragments of summer beneath their frozen feet. The cold, however, found its way through even the best preparations. The peasants knew it intimately, how it crept through seams, how it lingered behind the knees, how it whispered up from the floor at night. They had a word for it that has long since been forgotten, something between cold and hunger. It meant not just the absence of warmth, but the presence of something else, a quiet, numbing stillness that entered the bones and stayed there. They wore layers not just to resist it, but to remind themselves they were still alive underneath it all. Sometimes, the villagers spoke of garments that carried luck. A mother's old shawl, for instance, might keep her son warm even in the harshest storms, though it was thin and worn. Or a cap that, once worn by someone who survived a particularly bitter winter, was believed to hold a trace of that endurance. These were small superstitions, born from long winters of listening to the wind, to the creak of the rafters, to the unending dialogue between body and cold. In their quiet world, every stitch seemed to matter, every thread a small act of defiance. There was a curious practice found in some regions. Peasants would hang their heaviest garments above the hearth at night, not merely to dry, but to feed them with smoke. They believed the smoke carried warmth into the fibres, making the clothes stronger against the frost. Over time, the wool would darken, taking on the scent of fire and earth until it became nearly waterproof. Even today, if you close your eyes and imagine the scent of ancient wool soaked in smoke, you might almost feel that same warmth on your skin. It was not clean warmth, but it was honest, the kind that stayed even when the fire went out. For the very poor, clothing often passed through many lives before finding its last use. A tunic too torn for wear became a blanket. A blanket too thin became strips for bandages, or insulation for the walls. Nothing was wasted. Even threadbare linen could be boiled down to make pulp for sealing cracks in wooden huts. And so, the peasants lived, wrapped in their own history, their clothes carrying stains from the field, soot from the hearth, and the quiet persistence of those who came before. The garments were memory itself, worn against the wind. There were, however, strange beliefs surrounding what happened when someone froze to death in their clothes. The living feared those garments, believing they had absorbed not just the cold, but the spirit of it. Such clothing was never reused or burned. Instead, it was buried separately, often weighted down with stones, so the cold spirit could not rise again. A few whispered that, on certain nights, the garments of the dead rustled on their own, as if the wind remembered the shape of the person who once wore them. Whether anyone truly saw such things is uncertain, but the peasants did not take chances. They respected the cold, even in death. In the deeper parts of winter, when the snow thickened and the fields disappeared, the distinction between man and clothing blurred. The peasants became shapes of wool and smoke, faceless bundles moving through white silence. You could tell who someone was not by their face, often hidden under scarves and hoods, but by the sound of their steps, the rhythm of their work, or the familiar drape of a coat patched 100 times. Identity itself was layered, like their garments, functional, humble, and shaped by endurance. At night, when the fires dimmed, they slept fully clothed. Sometimes, families would sleep close together, sharing warmth through the shared exhalation of breath and the friction of fabric. It was said that, if you woke up before dawn, You could see faint trails of steam rising from the pile of bodies and blankets, as though they were one large creature breathing quietly beneath the frost. It was a strange kind of comfort, communal and wordless. In the dark, no one felt poor or alone. There was only the soft sound of life continuing, hidden beneath layers of wool, straw, and patience. The art of layering was, in truth, the art of acceptance. They did not fight the cold, they outlasted it, absorbed it, learned to move within its boundaries. Their clothing was not armor, but understanding. It acknowledged that warmth was fragile, fleeting, and all the more precious because of it. Each garment, however small, represented hope, made visible the hope that for another night, another dawn, the cold would not win. And so, when you imagine them walking through snow that reached their knees, smoke rising from their chimneys, like Sigh's picture, also the quiet dignity of their layers. Each thread was chosen not for beauty, but for survival. Each patch told a story of endurance, and each tear was a mark of a life that had kept going when it had every reason to stop. In that humble art of layering, they wore not just their clothes, but their history, their patience, and their quiet belief that even the poorest hands could still build warmth out of nothing but time. When the long night settled over the medieval countryside, sleep became not just rest but survival. In the frozen dark, when the fires faded to ash and the wind pressed against the shutters, sleep was a fragile bridge between the living and the waiting cold. The peasants learned to surrender to it slowly, cautiously, like stepping into a half-frozen stream, never certain if the night would return them unchanged by morning. For them, sleep was not a single act but a sequence, a rhythm of waking and drifting, shaped as much by the temperature as by the body's own patience. In those months when the sun barely climbed above the horizon, the nights were impossibly long, so long that people did not sleep them in one stretch. Instead, they practiced what we would now call segmented sleep. After sunset, they would rest for a few hours, a first sleep, then wake in the middle of the night, when the fire had nearly gone out and the air inside the cottage was sharp with frost. During this waking, they spoke softly, prayed, or tended the embers, coaxing a little warmth back into the room. Then, when their hands and thoughts had steadied, they returned to bed for the second sleep, drifting back into that half-dreaming world until dawn. No one questioned this pattern. It was simply how winter shaped the human rhythm. The body, like the earth, needed time to pause between darkness and light. The beds themselves were not what we imagine. They were rough frames stuffed with straw, sometimes mixed with dry leaves, covered by whatever cloth could be spared. The straw rustled with every movement, releasing a faint, sweet smell of the fields from which it came. Beneath the sleeping bodies, it slowly flattened over the months, packed hard and uneven, until it had to be replaced. In wealthier homes, the straw might be placed in a large sack, a primitive mattress, but in the cottages of the poor, it was simply piled loose and shifted when it grew too thin. People shared their beds with others, family members, neighbours, sometimes even animals. Warmth was communal. To sleep alone was a luxury few could afford, and an empty bed was a frightening sight in winter. It was said that sleep in winter was heavier, thicker somehow, as though the cold weighed it down. Dreams came slower, deeper, often touched by strange imagery. The villagers believed that the cold entered their dreams, shaping them into frozen landscapes where time did not move. There were tales of those who dreamt of walking endlessly through snow, hearing distant bells beneath the ice. One such story told of a woman who, after waking from such a dream, claimed she had seen her own footprints leading away from the house in the morning frost. No one knew if she had truly walked or if the dream had left its mark upon the world. Either way, for many winters after, people spoke her name softly when the nights grew too still. The way they slept said much about how they understood the world. Before lying down, they often performed small rituals, gestures of comfort against the uncertainty of the night. Some sprinkled a few grains of salt near the hearth, believing it trapped wandering spirits who sought the warmth of the living. Others whispered a blessing over the fire, asking it to breathe quietly through the night, not too strong, not too weak. Children were told to keep their feet together while sleeping, or else the frost spirits might slip between them and steal their warmth. These beliefs may sound quaint now, but they offered a sense of control in a world that gave little of it. The night, after all, was full of invisible things: the cold, the dark, the breath of those who slept beside you. The soundscape of medieval sleep was unlike anything we know today. The wooden walls groaned with the wind. The roof, thatched with straw, whispered faintly as frost formed on its edges. In the corner, the last logs cracked as they turned to embers, their glow pulsing like a slow heartbeat. There was the breathing of the sleepers, the shifting of straw, the quiet sigh of the animals outside. It was a symphony of survival, soft, rhythmic, and strangely comforting. The peasants were used to sleeping through these sounds, and in a sense, they depended on them. True silence complete. Absolute silence was considered unnatural, even dangerous. It meant the fire had died, the animals had gone still, and the frost had claimed everything. Some winter nights were so cold that the breath of the sleepers froze along the edges of the blanket, forming a thin rim of ice. In the morning, it glimmered faintly in the light, a fragile trace of the body's persistence through the dark. Children would sometimes lick the ice, laughing softly, not yet understanding that it was made of their own breath. Parents let them. There was something oddly hopeful in it, a reminder that warmth still lived inside them, no matter how deep the freeze outside. Yet, there was also fear, not of the cold itself, but of what might come with it. The peasants spoke of winter visitations, nights when the temperature dropped suddenly and sleep became too deep, too quiet. A person would lie still, not shivering, not moving, and by morning they would be gone. They called it the gentle taking, as if death in such a night was not cruel but merciful. The villagers buried those lost to the cold with their blankets still wrapped around them, believing it wrong to separate the body from the warmth it had tried so hard to keep. Over time, stories grew that, on certain nights, when the wind was right, you could see faint impressions in the frost where someone once lay sleeping, as though the earth remembered the shape of their rest. Despite the danger, there was comfort too. The cold created closeness, not just physical, but emotional. Families slept intertwined, children pressed between parents, everyone sharing the same rhythm of breath. In those dark hours, words were few. The language of warmth was touch, the slow exhale that kept frost from forming on the skin. Many described those nights as strangely peaceful, a kind of half-life between dreaming and waking, where the mind wandered freely and time seemed to stretch. They might wake for a moment, see the faint red glow of the fire, and feel an ancient, wordless gratitude that the light still lived. There were peculiar habits among the peasants that reflected this fragile balance. Some placed a stone, heated in the fire, at the foot of the bed before sleeping. The stone would cool slowly through the night, radiating a soft warmth. Others filled small cloth bags with ash from the hearth ash that still held the memory of heat and tucked them beneath their tunics. A few even kept small animals close to the bed, not just for companionship but for warmth. Cats, dogs, even chickens occasionally shared the space, each adding its small measure of heat to the living heap of bodies under the wool. Perhaps the most curious practice of all was what some called listening sleep. The old people claimed that if you let yourself half wake in the middle of the night and stayed still, you could hear the frost moving, the faintest crackle in the beams, the whisper of ice forming on the window's edge. It was said that those who learned this art could tell when the worst cold was coming, and would rise to add more wood to the fire just in time. Whether it was instinct or imagination, no one could say. But to those who lived by such rhythms, sleep was not a withdrawal from the world, it was a conversation with it. And so, each night in those frozen months, the peasants lay down beneath their layers of wool and straw, surrounded by the soft murmurs of the sleeping world. They did not dream of warmth, for warmth was not something they expected. It was something they made, moment by moment, breath by breath. In that long, frozen dark, sleep became their truest companion, gentle, patient, and as necessary as fire itself. And when dawn finally returned, faint and grey upon the horizon, it was not greeted with triumph, but with quiet endurance. The sleepers stirred, stretched their stiff limbs, and rose to face another day of cold. They had survived the night again, wrapped not in comfort, but in the simple, enduring act of resting together against the endless winter. When the long nights of winter deepened over medieval Europe, silence took on a different meaning. It wasn't the gentle quiet of rest or the peaceful stillness of dawn. It was the sound of survival, of life hanging on quietly in the frozen dark. In the small peasant villages, the air seemed to thicken with cold, muffling everything that once stirred with life. The fields were still, the animals hardly moved, and the rivers once full of song had turned to glass. The village became a world of faint sounds, each one carrying a kind of weight that words could not describe. Inside the cottages, sound became something measured and precious. The creak of wood in the rafters was the language of the house itself, an old groaning whisper that marked the passage of cold into the beams. When a log was added to the fire, the sudden hiss of sap meeting flame felt almost like speech, a comforting noise in a season that seemed to swallow all others. The soft breathing of a child under a wool blanket, the distant cough of a neighbour, the dull thud of a door closing against the wind. These were the threads of life's soundscape, delicate and rare, like the pulse of something trying not to fade. There was a strange comfort in that silence. For those who lived in it, it became a companion of sorts. Peasants often said that in deep winter, the world listened to itself. They believed that even the ground sleeping under frost could hear the prayers of those above it. It was not uncommon for a villager, walking alone at night, to stop suddenly, feeling as though the land itself had exhaled near their feet. The snow seemed alive then, whispering as it settled on the roof or sighed when it gave way beneath their boots. Many claimed the snow remembered things, that it carried the footsteps of past winters, and if one stood quietly enough, they might hear echoes of the dead, a shepherd's whistle, a cartwheel's creak, a mother calling her child home from the cold. At night, when the wind curled through the thatch, it often sounded like voices. Sometimes it was the low hum of a chant, other times it rose sharply, like laughter that vanished before it could be named. Children huddled close to their mothers would ask who was speaking outside, and the answer was always the same: it's just the winter talking. But some said it was more than that. The elders, with their weathered faces and long memories, told of wind spirits, invisible travellers that passed through villages during the longest nights. They were neither good nor evil, only old, older than the fields, older than the people. The peasants left a small bowl of ashes by the hearth for them, believing that the spirits warmed themselves there before continuing their endless journey. During the stillest hours before dawn, there was a kind of hum in the cold. Those who woke early to tend to the animals sometimes heard it, a faint, almost musical vibration that came from nowhere in particular. It could have been the wind threading through the chimneys, or the shifting of the ice on the river, but the villagers never agreed. Some said it was the sound of the world sleeping. Others thought it was the earth's own heartbeat. It was quiet, yet powerful, like a song too large for human hearing, echoing through the bones of everything that endured the frost. The animals, too, made their own winter music. Cows breathed out heavy clouds that glowed faintly in the dim light, the sound of their breath joining the rhythmic scrape of straw. Chickens clucked low and restless, their voices soft and tired. Dogs slept more deeply than usual, their faint growls and dream whimpers blending with the crackle of embers. Even the rats, those uninvited guests, moved differently in winter, slower, cautious, their tiny claws scratching faintly behind the walls. Nothing was loud, but everything spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of the small persistence of living things refusing to give up. And then there were sounds that belonged only to the cold itself. The splitting of ice on a water barrel, sudden and sharp. The groaning sigh of a tree under the weight of frost. The eerie chime of icicles breaking and falling in the night. Each sound felt magnified, as if the air itself held it a little longer before letting it go. Peasants said that in the depths of winter, the cold grew ears that it listened to every crack, every breath, every whispered word. It was why they spoke softly, indoors, even when they were alone. Too much noise, they believed, might wake something ancient that preferred the silence undisturbed. In some villages, there was an old superstition that the silence of winter was not merely the absence of life, but a sign of something watching. The elders told children not to whistle after dusk during the cold months, or to call anyone's name out loud when walking through the snow. The reason was simple: the cold might answer back, but not with a voice they would recognize. It was said that those who heard their own names whispered on the wind were being called into the frost, lured by the stillness itself. So they walked quietly, spoke softly, and always listened for the faint sighs of winter breathing around them. Yet for all its strangeness, there was a kind of peace in that soundless world. When a villager sat by the fire, the quiet wasn't lonely, it was protective. The silence wrapped around them like another layer of warmth. They could hear the slow tick of time in the settling of the wood, in the soft murmur of the wind against the shutters. The silence was a rhythm they had learned to live with, patient, steady, and oddly kind. In it, they could almost forget hunger, almost forget cold. It was as though the world had paused just long enough for them to rest, before everything began again in spring. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, when even the dogs refused to stir, a faint bell could be heard from far away, too far for any church to reach. It was always the same low tone, slow and distant, drifting through the frost. No one knew where it came from. Some said it was the sound of lost travellers, their souls still walking the snow-covered roads, ringing for warmth they would never find. Others said it was the earth's memory, replaying the tolls of old winters long past. But the strangest part was that it never frightened them. It was simply part of the season's strange language, another sound among the many that stitched their frozen nights together. And so, the silent village was never truly silent. Beneath the hush, the frost carried whispers of wood and wind, of beasts and breath, of the invisible and the remembered. The peasants did not fear this quiet. They belonged to it. It was the sound of endurance, the quiet conversation between life and winter. Every whisper, every creak, every frozen breath was a reminder that even in stillness, the world was awake, listening, waiting, and alive in its own slow way. Faith, in the medieval winter, was not just a matter of prayer, it was survival. When the world turned to ice and breath turned white, people clung to belief as they might cling to a fire in the night. In those frozen months, when the fields slept and the sun seemed to have forgotten them, faith was the one thing that did not grow cold. Yet, it was not always the gentle, comforting faith of light and hope that we imagine today. It was an older, stranger kind, filled with quiet fears, half-remembered stories, and rituals born from the uneasy meeting of religion and folklore. In the long dark of winter, peasants prayed more, not out of devotion alone, but out of quiet desperation. They prayed for the cold to break, for the grain to last, for the animals not to die before spring. The small village churches, often made of wood and stone, their roofs heavy with frost, were dim sanctuaries of breath and whispers. Candles burned low, their light trembling on walls damp with winter's touch. Sometimes, the priest's voice echoed faintly through the still air as he spoke of salvation. But outside, the snow seemed to listen too, pressing itself against the doors like something alive. Faith in those months was practical, tangible. It lived in gestures more than in sermons. A mother might cross herself before cutting the last loaf of bread. A shepherd might whisper a blessing into the frozen wool of a dying lamb. The child might hide a tiny carved cross under their straw pillow. Not for comfort, but for protection. They believed that winter itself carried unseen eyes, that somewhere in the white darkness, old spirits still lingered, hungry for warmth, for voice, for memory. And so, their prayers were not always directed upward. Sometimes, they were whispered sideways into the silence. Many villages had their own small legends, born from winters too long to forget. In one village, they spoke of the White Woman, a figure seen only during the hardest freezes. She was said to wander the fields wrapped in snow, her face pale as frost, her hands leaving no mark on the ground. Those who saw her were not doomed, not exactly, but the elders said she came to remind them of something. What it was, no one ever agreed upon. Some said she was a ghost of hunger itself. Others believed she was the winter's first breath made flesh, searching for the warmth that had left the world. Still others thought she was a forgotten saint, a protector of the poor, watching quietly to see if they still remembered kindness when the cold came. Stories like that lived side by side with faith, as naturally as breath with air. The church tolerated some of them, ignored others. A priest might preach against such tales by candlelight, yet the next evening he too might sprinkle salt on his doorstep to keep away the wandering frost. People didn't separate their beliefs, they layered them, like the clothes on their backs. The holy and the haunted coexisted easily in their world. The cross above the door was for God. The bundle of dried herbs hanging beside it was for everything else. There was also a strange rhythm to the spiritual life of winter. When the snow fell hardest and no one could travel, the villagers stayed inside and told stories. The telling itself became a kind of ritual. Grandmothers whispered of wolves that spoke with human voices, of wells that froze over, not from the cold, but from sorrow, and of saints who walked the night carrying candles made from starlight. Some tales were warnings, others small comforts. One story told of a man who shared his last candle with a beggar on a stormy night, only to wake and find the snow melted from his roof. They said the beggar had been an angel testing his mercy. Whether it was true or not, the story was retold every winter, as though saying it kept a little light alive in the dark. And yet, beneath the warmth of faith and folklore, there was fear, a quiet, patient fear that lived in everyone who had seen too many winters. They feared the cold, of course, but also the silence that came with it. They feared the way time seemed to slow, how the sun could vanish for weeks, leaving them in a kind of waking dream. Some feared the forest, most of all the dark edge of it, where the trees seemed to move in the corner of one's eye. They said that when the cold was strongest, the woods whispered back your thoughts, repeating them softly until you could no longer tell which voice was your own. It was during those nights that the villagers held what they called the quiet feast. There was no celebration in it, no laughter or music. It was a meal taken in silence, often by the poorest families, who would place a piece of bread on the windowsill before eating. It was meant for the dead, for those who had not survived winters past. They believed the spirits of their ancestors still roamed the snowdrifts, lost and cold, searching for familiar warmth. By feeding them, even symbolically, the living ensured that the dead would not envy their fires. Some of these customs may seem strange now, but to those who lived them, they made perfect sense. When the world around you feels alive in its own mysterious way, when frost paints your windows with patterns that seem almost deliberate, when the wind hums your name through the chimney, when you wake to find the snow outside shaped like a face you almost recognize, you learn to treat the unseen with respect. The villagers did not question whether their stories were real. They were part of the season, like hunger or the smoke that clung to the rafters. Even the church itself changed slightly in the winter month. The priests preached more softly, their sermons drifting like mist through the cold air. They spoke of patience, endurance, and humility, not triumph. They knew that in this season, people needed comfort more than judgment. And perhaps the priests, too, felt the strangeness of the long dark, when even faith seemed to flicker like a candle struggling against a draught. There was one more belief whispered only in secret, passed from old to young in hushed voices, that the long winter was not just a season, but a kind of soul, a sleeping giant beneath the land. Each year it stirred, stretching its icy limbs, and each spring it sank back into silence. To live through winter, they said, was to survive the breath of that sleeping thing. Some even claimed that the snow itself was its dream, soft, endless, and white. When spring finally came, it was not only the thaw that brought relief, but the breaking of the spell. The air filled again with sounds, water dripping, birds returning, the earth cracking open to breathe. The peasants would go to church then, thanking God for sparing them, but deep down they also thanked the old spirits, the white woman, the wind, and even the silence itself, because somehow, in their hearts, they felt that all of it, the holy and the haunted, had watched over them together through the long, cold night. And when the next winter came, as it always did, they would begin again the prayers, the small offerings, the stories whispered beside the fire. For in the medieval world, faith was not only belief in God, it was belief in survival itself, in the thin, flickering flame of life that no frost, no silence, and no darkness could quite extinguish. Death, in the medieval winter, did not always arrive suddenly. Sometimes it came quietly, drifting like frost through the cracks of a wooden door. It might begin as a shiver that refused to leave, a cough that lingered too long, or a night when someone simply did not wake. The villagers knew it was coming long before it appeared. They could feel it in the stillness, in the way the cold seemed to grow heavier, as if it were pressing down on their roofs, their chests, their thought. They did not speak of it often, but they prepared for it in small, almost tender ways. When the cold took lives, it did so gently, without sound or struggle. The old and the weak were usually the first to go. There was a saying in some villages, asterisk, winter takes what summer gives. Asterisk, it was not said in bitterness, but with a kind of resigned acceptance. Death was not a stranger, it was another visitor of the season, as inevitable as the snow itself. Yet each time it came, it left a mark that lingered in the smoke, in the slow rhythm of the days that followed. When someone died in winter, the village did not move quickly. The ground was frozen solid, the earth locked in ice, too hard to dig. So they laid the bodies in small barns or sheds, wrapped in linen and straw, waiting for the thaw. It sounds cold, even cruel, but to them it was simply practical. The living could not fight the frozen ground, and they believed the soul did not mind the delay. The dead were patient, they said. They understood the winter's grip. Sometimes, though, something strange was noticed. A few claimed that during the hardest freezes, they heard faint knocks from the direction of the barn where the dead lay, as if the frost itself was settling, cracking, or speaking. The older villagers told the younger ones not to be afraid. "It's only the cold remembering," they would say. "It echoes through everything." But on quiet nights, even the bravest avoided walking past those barns. There were small rituals for those who had passed. Before the body was wrapped, a candle was lit beside it, its flame trembling in the cold air. The light was believed to guide the spirit away from the house, so it would not linger and bring sorrow to the living. A bowl of water was sometimes placed near the door, not for washing, but as an offering. If the surface froze overnight, it meant the soul had left in peace. If it remained still and clear, the family whispered an extra prayer at dawn, just in case. The villagers mourned quietly. They did not wail or gather in great numbers, for winter did not allow such displays. Instead, grief was something soft, shared in glances and gestures. A neighbour might leave a bit of bread at a doorstep, or help patch a leaking roof without a word. The loss became part of the season's silence. It was absorbed by the snow, carried away in the slow drift of days. And yet, there were years when the deaths came too quickly, when the cold seemed to hunger for more than its share. Those winters were remembered for generations. The winters when the air itself felt like a living thing, prowling between the houses. There were tales of entire families found asleep beside the ashes of their fires, frozen in a quiet embrace. Some said they had simply grown tired, lulled into a final rest by the low hum of the wind. In one story passed down through the centuries, a village in the mountains faced a winter so severe that the snow buried their doors. The people could not even step outside. For weeks they burned everything. They owned chairs, tools, even the wooden icons from the church just to keep the fire alive. By the time the snow melted, only a handful remained. When the survivors finally emerged, they found strange footprints circling their homes, too large to belong to any animal. They said it was the spirit of the winter itself, walking the village, counting who was left. It's hard to know how much of that story was true, but what matters is that they believed it. Belief was their way of understanding what could not be changed. Death was not just an end. It was a reminder of how fragile warmth truly was. Every life taken by the cold taught the living to cherish what little heat they had, the glow of a candle, the warmth of another person's breath in the dark. The church offered comfort, but even faith was shaped by the frost. Priests would say that those who died in the cold were closest to purity, that the snow washed away all sin, leaving the soul clean as the winter sky. Some found peace in that thought, others found only questions. One farmer, it was said, refused to bury his wife in the thaw because he believed the ground had become too warm for her spirit to rest. He waited until the first frost returned, then dug her grave by moonlight, his breath rising like smoke in the night. There were other strange customs, half faith, half fear. In certain regions, people left a window slightly open after a death, even in the freezing air, to let the soul escape. To close it too soon was to trap the spirit, they said, and invite misfortune. Sometimes they sprinkled ashes in the doorway to see if the soul had passed. If in the morning they found a small pattern, a sign of disturbance, they believed the departed had found their way out. For children, death was explained gently. They were told that those who died in the winter simply went ahead to light the fires of spring. When the snow melts, a mother might whisper, it's because they are warming the earth from beneath. It was a small comfort, one that made the cycle feel less cruel, more connected. As for the living, they learned to read the signs of danger long before it struck. The human body, they knew, had ways of warning when the end was near. The skin grew pale, almost bluish, and speech slowed into silence. Some said the dying saw strange things in those final hours, that they spoke softly to invisible visitors, describing warm fields and running water, even as frost formed on their eyelashes. Whether these visions were divine or simply the mind's gentle escape, no one could say. Even after death, the cold did not relent. Funerals were brief. The bell, if the village had one, rang once or twice and then fell silent, the sound swallowed by the snow. Mourners' breaths mingled like smoke as they lowered their eyes, and then life continued because it had to. The goats still needed feeding. The children still needed warmth. Grief was carried quietly, tucked away like a folded cloth. What's strange, perhaps, is how little fear the peasants seemed to have of death itself. They feared hunger, cold, and loneliness far more. Death was not seen as an intruder, but as something familiar, even patient. It waited, as winter waited, as time itself waited. To survive in such a world, one could not live in denial of it. Instead, they learned to see it as part of the landscape, like the snow, like the silence, like the breath that faded into mist. And maybe that is the quiet lesson the medieval winter left behind, that life and death were not opposites, but neighbours sharing a wall of ice. On one side, the living huddled by their fires, whispering prayers into the dark. On the other, the dead rested beneath the same frost, their dreams blending with the snow. Between them, the cold lingered vast, watchful, eternal, reminding all who felt it that warmth was never to be taken for granted. The first thaw never came suddenly. It crept into the world quietly, almost shyly, as though testing whether it was truly allowed to return. The snow did not vanish all at once. It sagged, softened, darkened at the edges where the soil beneath began to stir. The air grew a little looser, the wind a little less sharp. No one celebrated it. They only noticed it in silence, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might drive it away again. It was not joy that they felt, not yet only relief, deep and wordless, like a long-held breath finally let go. For the peasants, this moment marked the slow awakening of everything. The roofs began to drip in slow rhythms, a steady tapping that filled the quiet. The paths through the village, once frozen like stone, turned to slush beneath their boots. Even the trees seemed to exhale, their bark darkening, the weight of ice sliding down in thin rivulets. To the villagers, these sounds were a kind of music. After months of silence, even the dripping of water was enough to make them pause and listen. Inside their homes, the air still smelled of smoke and straw, but there was something else now, a hint of damp earth, a promise of green hidden beneath the mud. Fires were kept smaller, more out of habit than necessity. The children noticed first, as children always do. They stepped outside and watched their breath fade quicker than before, surprised by how strange it felt not to see the world through a mist of frost. They kicked at the half-melted snow, found small puddles forming, and laughed softly, though the laughter, even then, seemed cautious, as if the winter might be listening. For the adults, the thaw brought work endless, heavy work. The roofs needed mending, the tools sharpening, the fields clearing of what the frost had left behind. But in their movements, there was a new rhythm, one that carried a quiet gratitude. Each swing of the spade, each repaired wall, was a kind of conversation with the world, a gentle way of saying, "We're still here." In the frozen months, they had spoken mostly to each other, or to God, or to the silence. Now they spoke, wordlessly, to the earth. There was something strange, too, about those first days. As the snow melted, things long hidden began to return. Lost tools, forgotten toys, a missing chicken bone, and sometimes things older still. A shard of pottery, a bone too large to name. The thaw revealed what the winter had kept secret. Some villagers said the earth had a memory, and when it warmed, it remembered everything. They treated whatever appeared with quiet respect, as though the soil itself was giving something back. And then came the smell, a deep, dark scent of decay and rebirth. It was not pleasant, not at first. The snow had preserved everything it covered, the old leaves, the remains of animals, the damp straw in the barns. As it melted, all of that rose into the air. But the peasants did not wrinkle their noses. To them, That smell was proof of life's return. "The world is breathing again," they would murmur. "Let it smell of what it remembers." The thaw also brought danger. The rivers, swollen with melted ice, overflowed their banks. Roads disappeared underwater. Fields turned to mud so deep it could swallow a boot hole. Yet even this chaos felt different, alive. Unpredictable, but alive. The people watched it with a strange calm, as though they were witnessing a long-forgotten ritual. They knew that soon the mud would dry, the air would sweeten, and the first buds would appear. Until then, patience was still their greatest strength. In the evenings, as the days grew longer, they gathered once more around their hearths, though now the fires were small and slow. The talk turned gentle about planting, about animals, about how many candles they had left. Someone might recall the harshest nights, the frozen wells, the sound of wolves howling across the empty hills. But even those memories seemed softer now, as if the cold itself had retreated into story. The winter that once felt endless had become something almost tender, a test survived, a shadow that no longer frightened but humbled. And somewhere in the background, always, was the sound of dripping water falling from eaves, from branches, from the edges of the world. It was like the heartbeat of the earth returning after a long sleep. Some believed that if you listened closely, you could hear voices in it, the faint whisper of those who had not survived the winter, blending with the sound of meltwater. It wasn't frightening. It was comforting in its own way. As though the dead, too, were melting back into the soil, becoming part of the life that would soon bloom again. One old superstition lingered among the villagers, that the very first puddle of the thaw held luck. Not gold, not miracles, just quiet luck. A child who stepped in it barefoot would be spared fever that year. A woman who touched it to her eyelids would see clearly through lies. A man who looked into it at sunrise might glimpse the reflection of his own fate. Of course, no one truly believed these things, not entirely, but they did them anyway. Perhaps it was not belief that mattered, but the small ritual itself, the way it reminded them that the world still held wonder, even after all the harshness. In the fields, the snow retreated like a vanishing dream, leaving behind patches of grass, flattened and yellow but alive. The first birds returned hesitant at first, their songs faint and broken, like someone remembering a tune. The villagers listened, heads tilted, as though hearing language after months of silence. It felt almost sacred. The world, once again, was learning how to speak. When the first true sunrise came, not the pale, cold light of winter, but a golden warmth spreading slowly across the thatched roofs, the village stirred as one. People stood outside, eyes half closed, faces turned toward it. They didn't smile, not exactly. They simply stood there, letting the sun touch them, letting the long months of stillness dissolve into its glow. It was the simplest of moments, yet it carried the weight of everything they had endured. No one needed to say it aloud, but each of them knew they had survived. And maybe that is the quiet beauty of it, that survival itself was their story. Not the battles or kings or castles that fill history books, but the quiet, endless act of enduring. The peasants did not see themselves as heroes. They were simply people who waited out the dark and found the light again. Year after year, life after life, winter after winter. The cold took, the thaw returned, and in between they lived. In that rhythm, the freezing and the melting, the dying and the blooming, there was something profoundly human. To them, winter was not the enemy. It was a teacher. It reminded them of fragility, of patience, of how precious warmth could be. And when the thaw came, it reminded them that even the hardest seasons must end, that even silence eventually breaks into song. So as the snow melts from the last rooftops and the streams begin to flow once more, the village exhales. Smoke drifts lazily into the pale blue sky. Somewhere, a door creaks open, and someone steps outside, squinting against the light. The air smells of wet soil and faint ash. The world feels both new and ancient, as if it's beginning again for the 1000th time. And somewhere, beneath it all, the cold lingers still deep in the earth, waiting for its turn to return. But for now, it sleeps. For now, the thaw belongs to the living. Good night, my friend. May your dreams be gentle, your breath warm, and your sleep deep like the earth itself, resting after the long, silent winter.